think about that?
Well, I think the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas and the Toltec and all of those ancient people, I think South America and Central America is just cram-filled with interesting ancient stuff. And we tend to feel that the Egyptians and the people from that area of Africa and in Europe somehow or another got over here to South America because we still have the same pyramids and the same symbolism. We find the same symbolism in Central and South America we find in the Middle East. And so obviously they came from the Middle East and Egypt and Africa across to South and Central America. I'm saying, maybe not. Maybe it started in Central America and South America and went to that way. Why do you, and I am totally convinced in my own mind that the most ancient cultures on the face of the earth, as in South America and Central America, probably 100,000 years old or more, in Peru and Brazil and that whole area of the world, I think, is just replete with ancient stuff that far, far exceeds anything Egypt ever did. So I'm seeing that there's a whole world of questions that we've never been allowed to ask. I think the Central and South America is the epitome of ancient civilizations. I don't even know, I don't think that the ancient Mayas and the Aztecs and those people, those are the ones we know of. I think that there were some very old ones, like Earth Base 1. Earth Base 1 is in the Andes. It's as high up in the Andes as you can get. And it is a profoundly, it's so high up that people going there today can hardly breathe. Even mountain climbers say it's very difficult to breathe. It's so far, so high up, and yet the stones are like 100 tons, 300-ton stones, and they're all cut flawlessly and pieced together. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, who moves 200-ton stones in air that even the best mountain climbers can hardly catch their breath? And there's no way to plant food up there. You don't plant anything up at that height. So how did these people feed themselves and move 200 and 300-ton stones? And not one, from all over. They're just huge temples built with these stones. And I'm saying somebody better start looking at this. I'll tell you what I think really happened. I think that we are a creation of someone else. I think that's what happened. I think somebody came here a long time ago and created us. No. And they're still with us.
But before the Illuminati were the reptilians?
The reptilians were the first colonists on this world. They, for all intents and purposes, own this planet, and that's how they still think. And they are still here. Of course, they were colonizing a continent called Lemuria, which no longer exists. They went underground or into the inner earth, and then they started coming up during the Sumerian times, interbreeding, hybridizing the population so that there's a human and reptilian genetics in all of us. Each one of us has reptilian genetics. And you can see this as a fetus develops in the womb. During the first few weeks of existence, the fetus is an androgynous reptilian, and only then is mammalian genetics opened up in it, proving a hybridization.
Is it possible? Is it possible that there were superior beings on the earth in the deep past, living here, and at some point creating us as their slaves and servants? Well, there's certainly evidence that they were here, and it's all around us. Next slide. You got some of it here in the neighborhood. Megalithic stones from anywhere in the world. These are only 50 tons. These are pretty light. But you will notice that science focuses on one thing when they try to discuss megalithic stones and how they might come to be. How did the primitive people move them there? How did they set them up? How did they move them there? And that is not the issue. They do that to get you to look away from the real issue, which is, how did they cut them out? How did they cut them out? Not how did they... Moving them's hard enough, but cutting them out is impossible. Because why? We can't do it today. Next slide. This is the classic. This is an ancient 1,170, what you were just looking at was 50, 1,170-ton obelisk lies unfinished at the Aswan Quarry. A crack rendered the stone unusable. Now, this thing's about, what, 130 feet long, about 40, 50 feet wide, whatever. 30 feet, it doesn't matter. It's huge. You ever been there? You ever seen it? Anybody? It sits in a hole about 15 feet deep. This is it. The guy taking the pictures. It's in a hole. It's got just those little edges where they worked it, but they've got it pretty much done. They're working on the spire here. This is the mark of a machine. Now what they say is that this is of course done with stone. That Stonehenge was done with stone. Everything was cut with stone. This is pink granite. One of the hardest stones in the world. Those blue stones at Stonehenge, aren't they the hardest stones in the world? How do you cut stone on stone when you're working with some of the hardest stones there are? And you polish them to a high sheen. Look at some of the obelisks that they finished. How big and beautiful they are. How were they doing that? What abrasives were they using on those? It's incredible. So they're working on this one, and this is not a little stone axe chopping it out. This is some kind of the equivalent of a big belt sander taking out chunks of pink granite the size of the seat that you're sitting on. And they were pressing right here with the belt sander, taking this out, shaping the point, and oh, they pressed too hard and they cracked it. And they unbuckled that machine and they just went away and they left it for us to marvel at. But now, let's think about it a minute. What's the real problem here? It's not cutting it here and shaping it. It's that final cut through the bottom to get it up. How could they do that? We could not today, we do not have a saw blade today that could pass through that, under that, because the weight of the stone would absolutely freeze it as soon as it got up under it. It could not be done. Impossible. So no primitive people, but it's just like saying somehow they did it with abrasives. Somehow they did it. Somehow. They didn't do it. That's the key. They didn't do it. The gods did this. The Anunnaki did this. No other way. All right? Now, let's talk for a minute about the possibility that they created us. If the Sumerians are correct about that they were at least here and clearly leaving their fingerprint all over the place with these megalithic stones, some of which are much bigger than this. You got 2,000 tonners in Baalbek and Tiwanaku. So then it stands to reason that they could be right about them creating us. Does it not? Let's look at that possibility. Next slide. We found in the late 1980s that we could look at our mitochondrial DNA of our females and determine where we originated in time as a species, because the mitochondria mutates at a certain rate. So geneticists said at the time, well, let's take the mitochondrial DNA of a large example of women around the world and see if humans began to split from that ape ancestor closer to 8 million years ago or closer to 5 million years ago, which was the gospel among scientists when this project got underway. And the mitochondria, you need to understand, is not in the nucleus. And this relates to the star chocolates. We're looking at the same thing, but it's outside the nucleus. And so it only passes down through females because sperm are too small to pass it on. So your mitochondria goes down through females. So we said, okay, we'll look at the female mitochondria and we'll see if it's closer to 8 million years, closer to 5 million years. When the answer came in, everybody was flabbergasted. Because it's not 8 million years, it's not 5 million years, it's only about 200,000 years. 200,000 years beyond that, we don't seem to exist as a species.
Now, not only did this work indicate how old the oldest humans were, they indicated where they came from. They said they came from southern Africa.
And guess what? When this work came in, next slide please, guess what? The oldest women were from southern Africa. And boy, do you think Newsweek had to swallow hard before they put this cover on to go down into the deep south in my part of the country of the United States. To say Adam and Eve were black, are you kidding me? In the south? So they made them look as white as they possibly could, which of course annoyed the heck out of the blacks. So in trying to have it both ways, Newsweek caught it coming and going, but they told the truth because it's clear. The oldest female humans come from southern Africa, just where the Sumerians claim we started. Pretty odd coincidence, isn't it? Next slide. Okay, now what are the odds again of us being created? Well, something certainly happened here. The cerebral cortex is the deeply convoluted surface region of the brain that is most strongly linked to intelligence. It's that staining on the outside. You peel that off of a rat, it'll cover a postage stamp. Peel it off a monkey, it'll cover a postcard. Peel it off a chimpanzee, a sheet of typing paper. Peel it off of us, 4 sheets of typing paper. Something clearly happened here. This is not a transition of any kind. This is a transformation. More than that, we only use maybe a half sheet, maybe a sheet of what we have. These guys use all theirs, but we're different. We have a completely different wiring system. And we only use a part of it. Now, you get a lot of argument about this now because nobody wants to really deal with this from the scientific end of things. But the truth of it is, there's been enough research done on savants. Used to be called idiot savants. They're called savants now. You all remember Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man. There are over 100 of those folks. And each of them, in the damage to their good part, whether that's 10% or 20% or whatever it is, the damage to the good part, they get a ray of light, like this beam here, into some other part of the shut-off part in our brains. Why? Because the Anunnaki would not have made their slave and their servant be anywhere near as smart as them. But they had to give us their bodies. We shall make the Adamu in our own image after our own likeness. They had to give us their bodies, including their brains. But they had to do something to shut it off so we would not be as smart as them. So they gave us only partial use, just enough to be smart enough so that they could tell us what they wanted us to do and depend on us to go off and do it, like good slaves and servants. But never to be smart enough to challenge them. And we know that, and we know their brains are in our heads and that their brains are super powerful relative to ours, because in savants they get these incredible abilities in math, in music, in art, in sculpture. Abilities that are so far beyond our normal geniuses, it's not even funny.
They are called gods, but they were humanoid beings of a rather reptilian type. The texts of Eden that I translated depict clearly and quite frequently the reptilian features of the gods. I personally estimate that the gods arrived approximately 300,000 years ago. And this derives from the fact that Homo sapiens arrived shortly after. I say this because throughout the text, genetics and the transformation of the human being are recurrent themes. The 2 particles that compose the word Eden are E, which means home, and Din, or Tin, which is life. But indeed, they are not alone. Humans are already on Earth. Who are these human beings?
All right, so you have an actual archaeologist who just happens to be French, telling you in no uncertain terms that, the reptilians, aka the Anunnaki, are legit. They're legit. They come here first. Now here's my understanding as I know it. Humans naturally evolved on this planet through adaptation and mutation, which is documented. This Darwinian idea of evolution is bullshit. But adaptation and mutation, no, that's legit. So, but for whatever reason, we had human beings here. All right. Now, the reptilians come, aka the Anunnaki. They come, and the reptilians come claiming to be Anunnaki, claiming to be the gods, claiming to be humanity's savior. But in fact, we find out that the Garden of Eden is not a paradise. The Garden of Eden is in fact a slave camp for the reptilians to enslave humankind, to be used for various things, including food, I might add. All right, so there's one misconception that has been dealt with right there, because everybody, the biblical account says, oh, it was a paradise, and Adam and Eve were there, and God was with them, and then this evil snake come along, and According to the ancient Sumerian writings, the Garden of Eden was a slave camp run by the reptilians